Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I'm a philosopher, not a dietitian, although I have recently been writing a fair amount about diet and healthcare, thanks to the increasing prominence of conversations dealing with that in the national media, as I'm sure you're aware. And when I was asked to speak on the social responsibilities of healthcare professionals, my mind immediately turned to one primary one, which is of interest to me as a philosopher, and as a philosopher of science more particularly. And that is the way in which things that are close to our hearts or our bellies or our welfare, in a sense, can lead us to get a bit confused, can lead us to overstate evidence, can lead us to being hyperbolic instead of soberly considering evidence, and telling people the limits of our knowledge, in a sense confessing to the fact that we don't know as much as we might like to know. Instead, I think we often try to pretend that we're certain about things and present a case that's far more strong than the evidence in fact warrants. And so my starting point is that if we go back to the fundamental precept of medicine or of healthcare in a sense, or first do no harm, is that statement isn't only relevant to treatment, because we could be doing a more general sort of harm in terms of causing people to think less well about things. We could be causing people to not be as able as they should be to evaluate risks and to adopt a kind of epistemic humilities, epistemologies, the theory of knowledge. So the fact that we do tend to treat our health as a good in itself, as I mean in the fields that you work in, you'd be very, very familiar with this. The fact that we do tend to treat our health as an end in itself shouldn't obscure us to the reality that there are other things that are important as well. And in my view, one of the things that's most important is our ability to reason and reach justified sorts of conclusions. So that's what I think our fundamental, or your fundamental, social responsibility is to encourage people to think, because that way they'll make better choices than if they didn't think. And the problem that you're all faced with, that we're all faced with, no matter what our field is this thing that Herbert Simon, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, laid out in a 1971 paper in which he described this thing called the attention economy. And I mean, I've kind of fabricated those lines, but the basic idea is that the rate of information just keeps on increasing, right? And we keep getting bombarded with more and more information, and at the same time our attention spans just can't cope with this. Okay, so we're all busy, we're far more busy than we used to be, and think back to kind of a rural agrarian pastime, and imagine that one isn't one of the kind of poor farmers, but you're a farmer who has time to have leisure and read and walk around and be a kind of gentleman farmer. Or what's gentleman's equivalent? Is that one? No, lady sounds insulting. I wonder if there is one. Anyway, we can talk about that at tea. Anyway, but the point is that the gap between what you're able to focus on and what there is to focus on just keeps on increasing. And what I think that leads to, and you know this by reading newspapers and magazines, what that leads to is increasing hysteria and hyperbolic headlines, because you want to capture people's attention. And you don't capture people's attention by saying, yeah, we think we've got some idea about what's going on here, but the science is still a bit confusing and evidence points one way and points the other way. But on balance of probability, we think this is the case. That's not going to sell the headlines. But you all know that that's the truth, right? And that's what our conclusions actually apply. What sells the headlines is X causes cancer. Or X is going to make you sick and die. And Y is the miracle drug that's going to cure you, right? That's what sells the headlines. So it's no surprise that that's what gets comments, that becomes increasingly popular. So that kind of hysteria and hyperbole sells the books and is popular, but at the same time it completely misrepresents the science, and as I'll try to argue, makes us all a bit dumber, because it encourages us to reach for these sorts of gods, in a sense, for these gurus who can guide us through this landscape. So you pick an authority and you trust them because the information is just too confusing to work through yourself. And the other element of this is that because we're so deeply invested in certain outcomes, in this case our health, we are primed to believe in things that suit the narrative we'd like to accept, right? So if you are in a particular field and your career or your reputation is built around defending that particular field, it's called confirmation bias. If you've done any psychology, you know about this. The idea of counting evidence that works in your favor far more strongly than evidence that counts against your point of view. Okay? So we tend to latch on to things that suit us, the things that make sense to us and that validate our choices, rather than things which undermine them. We don't like to be wrong, right? So you kind of ignore the evidence that tells you you're wrong. And Jonathan Haidt, who's a wonderful psychologist, wrote this lovely paper called The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tail. And the point he was making in that is that the emotional dog and its rational tail, the dog, us in other words, we choose a point of view and then we retrospectively justify it. Okay? So it's not as if you typically develop or come to a view based on the evidence for most people, and then you can defend that point of view. You encounter a point of view in the world, it attracts you, or you grow up with it or something like that, and then you spend your time trying to justify it in retrospect. But we very seldom change our minds about something, especially things that are fundamental. And that's a skill we need to train, we need to learn. I mean, I've been teaching similar sorts of subjects now for 17 years, and students are getting worse at this, unfortunately. And I think this is partly because of this attention economy thing. They don't have the time to learn about thinking anymore. They've got to kind of hit the ground running with opinions, with worldviews, because everyone's demanding that they have something to say. You don't have the time to just think anymore. So to kind of slowly develop a worldview. When I started at UCT in 1990 as a student, I could do a kind of mix of philosophy, English, and drama or something like that, because that's what you did. You know, you went and got an education and then figured things out later on. Whereas now you come in and I'm going to be a CA or something, and from day one you're kind of training for this particular task. So set that against this idea of orthorexia, so a kind of fixation, a disordered fixation on righteous eating. Where food is no longer just something that's the same to you. Food is a moral battleground. Food is something where you can sin now. And it's not as if we trust people to make these choices and to self-regulate. And we're right not to trust them because but people have trained them to be infants in this regard, have trained them to not have choices because they've been told this is too complicated, trust in some sort of expert. Don't trust, in a sense, some sort of traditional understanding of what's healthy, what's not, or trust your body or whatever it might be. You need to find a guru and latch on to them. And this comes at a cost. As I said, it comes at the cost of infantilizing us. The other problem is this narrative of victimhood that comes alongside it, where food companies are out to kill us. You know, they're out to kill us because they wanted to sell their products at any cost, but they're poisoning you with all the sugar and whatever it might be. So suddenly they're villains, and our task is to defend ourselves against these evil, big food, big pharma, big ag, all of these things that are out to get us, but we need to kind of constantly be on alert against these threats to us. So where in that narrative does personal responsibility fit in? Where in that narrative is it your fault? Okay, if there's always somebody to blame, when is it ever your fault that you are sick or unhealthy or overweight or whatever it might be? Okay, so sure, there's elements of these things that are beyond our control, and you can have a conversation around misleading labeling and hidden sugars or whatever it might be. But leaving that aside, if things are made clear to you when you make your choices, at some point you've got to be able to say, well, you made a choice, and those are the consequences of the choice, and I'm sorry nobody lied to you about that. Okay, so by taking that part of the narrative out of the equation completely, we get turned into these dependents, where it's somebody else's fault and you're a victim. And victims don't have any agency, they don't have any power, and to some extent I think they become crippled, intellectually crippled. The idea peddled by some people in the scientific community that we can have certainty about things is of great concern to me, and I'm sure it's of great concern to you as well, because working on the coalface of these things, that there are often, or always, uncertainties and insecurities and new data that needs to come in, and an imperfect picture. And science knows that it doesn't know everything. As the comedian Dara O'Brien points out, it knows it doesn't know everything, otherwise it would stop, right? We know that there's no certainty, and we know we need to keep on looking for more and better data. But that attitude, we don't communicate to the public, by and large, because as I was saying earlier on, we have books to sell, or we have practicing rooms to fill, or whatever it might be. And we don't give people that kind of complex or full coherent picture of things. And why that's a problem in a broad sense is that it completely obliterates a very important dividing line. And that dividing line is the one between science and pseudoscience. Once you start speaking in the same sorts of tones of certainty, of salvation and being cast asunder, you know, when you sin and you eat the wrong thing, and all of that kind of religious rhetoric in food, you start sounding just like a quack, you know, like a Dr. Oz or something. Because you present things as certain where they are not. And the whole game of proper scientific inquiry is exactly opposite to that. It's about the uncertainties. It's about knowing that things are not settled. Whereas the pseudoscientific point of view does not allow for that nuance either. So we're competing with sensation, both in terms of the quackery and their kind of seductive claims, but also with sensation in the sense that hyperbole and attention-grabbing headlines and evangelism, as I was saying a moment ago, undermine public understanding of the scientific method. So again, our responsibilities, our social responsibilities, is to keep on saying it's complicated. Is to keep on saying don't be dogmatic about things. You know, understand that you can't be certain and that you must allow the evidence to change your mind if the evidence comes along and is compelling. So what does the alternative look like? A responsible epistemic approach, an approach that respects this uncertainty, this ambiguity, and that gives us a better chance of reaching well-justified conclusions in the long run. And we should think long term, not short term, not about the next day or the next book to sell or whatever it might be. Is objective regarding the data, doesn't have any vested interests in wanting a certain outcome, so tries to avoid that emotional dog rational tail confirmation bias I was talking about. It's willing to be wrong, obviously. Okay, so if you discover new evidence that contradicts something you believed before, you have to be able to change your mind. You can't keep on selling the same message as before. And of course, it engages with arguments rather than character. I mean, another thing that happens in this battleground where food becomes this moral war between us, it can get personal, and people can start doubting motives. People can start attacking people's motives rather than their arguments. And I think this is particularly true when we're here at Nestle see anything, and that's particularly true when you talk about corporations and funding. And people will read a paper and say, but look at that person's affiliations. That's not an argument. There's no argument there. I mean, even if they're affiliated to X or to Y, you still need to engage with the argument and say, and the evidence is faulty, or and the argument is poor, or whatever it might be. There's no guarantee that this person's been corrupted by who they get money from. Sure, on a completely kind of objective level, if you aggregate out all the data, you might find more taint or more corruption in some areas than in others. But the argument isn't over yet, is what I'm saying, once you find some sort of funding source. So those are some elements of it, and we all share this commitment to principles like this, clear reasoning, trying to work things out, careful rhetoric, not abusing people, not being insulting, not being ad hominem, etc. Showing science in practice, showing it at work in a sense, by being neutral and objective and calm and careful, etc. Avoiding dogmatism and absolutism. You can't say, we know for sure that X is the case, that something is the case, because we don't. There's always going to be some wiggle room, and not merely defending our conclusions in spite of any contrary evidence. So, to sum up what I've been saying so far, when we're talking about health, and diet and exercise and all of these sorts of things, wonderful. We do need to pay attention to those things, but at the same time, thinking is also healthy. And being able to think well is also healthy. So all of those conversations shouldn't come at the cost, at the expense of paying attention to our thought processes and our reasoning and reaching justified conclusions. That's also important. And I would say, my view is that it's more important. Food is certainly not trying to kill you, right? And that's the other thing to note, to point out. I mean, some of these headlines makes you wonder whether your food is actually kind of sentient and out to get you. So let's come to one of the foodstuffs that's allegedly trying to kill us, which is sugar. So that's an image which I grabbed from the Harmony Diet, or what they call the Harmony Clinic, which runs a sugar addiction program. Outpatient and inpatient, an 8-week and a 12-week sugar addiction program at a fairly significant cost. And this is one of the images of that on their website, which I imagine is going to frighten you. I hope it does. So going back to the beginning, I mean, Paracelsus in the 15th century pointed out to us that the dose makes the poison. And this is the first really obvious thing to point out when anybody talks to you about addiction, is that you'll struggle to find any substance that just in itself, at a particular dose, at a low dose, is actually that bad for you. Right? And if you moderate your behavior, if you moderate your dosage, etc., you can get away with a hell of a lot. And our bodies are fairly resilient and have survived various things for very many years. So the dose makes the poison, and here is exactly where the conversations around additives and added sugars and things can, of course, become relevant, in the sense that if you don't know that you're consuming, 20 teaspoons of sugar every soft drink you have or whatever, that's information you might want to have, because you might not know what dosage you're taking. But there are few substances that don't have any safe dosage, where any amount of it is poisonous or toxic or dangerous, etc. And many of us, and before this whole diet nonsense started, many of us have been eating sugar and carbs without any problems whatsoever. But now suddenly it's dangerous, then it's a problem. So most of us have muddled by, okay, you're putting on a few kilograms, we did less, we've worked it out without these huge bands. The reason why the sugar addiction thing has gained some traction, has gained some prominence, there's two quite influential papers that have allowed the sugar addiction narrative to gain traction. I'm just going to highlight two of them for you. Nicole Avina's 2007 paper in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews pointed out to us that sugar, as common as it is, nonetheless meets the criteria for a substance of abuse and may be addictive for some individuals when consumed in a binge-like manner. I didn't add those quotation marks, because they're in the original paper. So if you're getting a paper which argues that sugar is addictive, it's surely immediately of concern that the author puts addictive in quotation marks. So they're kind of distancing themselves, they're ironizing the whole thing. So tell me, is it addictive or isn't it? And I know what addictive means. So now, I'm not criticizing Avina. I mean, Avina seems to be a fine scholar by all accounts. I'm criticizing the people who read this and say, look, sugar's addictive, there's proof. And they are out there, and you know I'm not going to talk about particular people, but you know what I'm talking about. So that's the one problem, is that people read this thing. The other thing that just boggles the mind, which happened this morning, is that a person who you might know, if I were to mention who he is. Oh yes. So there's this. You've probably read the new USDA, not USDA, the new guidelines, the new American. What's the organisation called? One for long acronym. Well, you probably might not have read it. It's like 500 pages long. But I've skimmed through it and read the exact summary. But so the thing that's going around right now, there's this Malcolm Kendrick, who you might have heard of, and he's got this post in which he explains how, we're all vindicated now because these guidelines tell us that saturated fat is no longer on the nucleus of concern list, and cholesterol is not a problem, and the key thing is sugar to worry about. So now it's very easy for even a layperson to download this 500-page document and do a word search. So he's got quotes around nutrient of concern. So you can do a word search for nutrient of concern. And of course the phrase that he quotes is nowhere in this report. And if you read it further and do a word search for saturated fat, the report says saturated fat remains a concern, and you should limit it to no more than 10% of your calories. So they're just making this stuff up, right? And so one of our favorite people in the health industry, in the media, was tweeting this thing this morning, saying, look, they're all wrong and they're evil and whatever. And it's like, well, why are you making things up all the time? so that's the problem. And so going back to my main theme, is that there are all these people, the whole kind of flock, retweeting this and getting all enthusiastic and saying, see, we were right all along. When are you all going to apologize? And UCT academics are one of the bad people in this story. So when are the UCT academics going to apologize for demonizing this diet and whatever? Well, on the basis of that evidence, not yet. Anyway. The second paper is Johnson and Kenny's paper in Nature Neuroscience in 2010, where I'm again just highlighting an element of it. Notably, it is unclear whether deficits in reward processing are constitutive and precede obesity, or whether excessive consumption of palatable food can drive reward dysfunction and thereby contribute to diet-induced obesity. So they're saying quite explicitly that it's unclear whether the addiction, precedes the overconsumption, or whether the overconsumption causes the addiction. Again, if you read the papers rather than read the headlines, you don't get evidence or proof that sugar is addictive. Yet these are the things that people are using as evidence. Now there's a vast difference, a world of difference between saying people like things and tend to overdo things that they like versus things being addictive. Okay? The one can be controlled by various things, by education or whatever. The other one can perhaps only be treated clinically or not treated at all. I'll come back to that in a moment. But so that's why this language is really dangerous. Because if you tell people that they're addicts, again, back to the responsibility point, they suddenly think, well, they're saying, I can do that. So that's not the message you want to send now. You want to keep on telling people, yes, there are things you can do, and you should keep trying to do that. You don't tell people that they're pathetic and helpless and can't do anything. So here's another example of this, which really makes me mad. I mean, so the City Press just last month or 2 months ago now had this sugar scale thing accompanied by one of these scare stories about sugar. So you'll see what they're doing there. They're searching out the hidden sugar. So we go from Tabasco, which has 0 grams of sugar. We've got a sweet chili sauce there, which has got massive amounts of sugar. And here's the evil soda can with 10.6 grams of sugar. But if I were to say to you a Boeing jetliner uses X amount of fuel and a lawnmower uses Y amount of fuel, the scales are entirely not comparable. You drink a can of soda, you don't drink a whole bottle of sweet chili sauce. You use a teaspoon or 2 of it. Okay? So that graph is just utterly misleading. But this is the way in which they sell this hysteria, is through sort of this, the layperson looks at it and says, damn, Coke's got a lot of sugar in it, I've got to stop eating it. And my sweet chili sauce is especially dangerous. Our South African favorite, Mrs. Paul's chutney, is also really evil. Okay, so that's misleading. I mean, it's dishonest. So back to the addiction stuff. I mean, you'll have seen pretty fMRI pictures. Here's the first lesson as to why fMRI is really dangerous in the hands of a layperson. That's a dead fish. That's a dead fish that was put under fMRI, and you see a little bit of brain activity in this dead fish. And what this highlights is something that lay people don't understand about fMRI, is that it's a complicated bit of analysis that uses vastly complicated software which aggregates across thousands of images, and there's lots of noise. There's lots of noise in this data. You try to filter it out using your software, but there are always going to be artifacts in data sets that are that complicated, that involve so many different data points. So you can get these random artifacts which don't give you any confidence that you're seeing something that's in a sense worrying or reliable even. And the fMRI narrative feeds into this idea that it's not you, it's your brain, right? So again, you're a victim. You can't help it because you've got brain chemistry that causes you to feel a certain sort of addictive urge or impulse, whatever it might be. And the concern here, the way in which to articulate this in terms of the social responsibility aspect, is that it's far easier to make choices if people tell you that you can choose things. If people tell you that there are choices to be made and that you are competent to make those choices. Okay, back to what I was saying a moment ago, if you tell people that you are dependent, that you're an addict, that you're helpless, then of course they'll become less able to make choices. Okay, so it's not just about your patient or whatever in front of you. It's about how we encourage society to think about agency and responsibility. Not only our patients, but also in the media, also in our friendship circles, etc. We try to encourage people to think and to choose, and the way you do that is to remind them that there are choices to be made, not to tell them that they have no choices. The brain disease model of addiction, which is what the sugar thing taps into, doesn't allow you to do that. It tells you that you are helpless, that you are a victim. And here's why it's wrong, various reasons why it's wrong. Firstly, it gets addiction wrong. So leaving aside whether sugar is addictive at all, okay, I don't think it is, but leaving that aside, even addiction as we ordinarily understand it, heroin, cocaine, marijuana, whatever, we misunderstand it in the sense that addiction of those sorts has fundamental elements of a voluntary behavior in itself. Most addicts quit by themselves, usually around their 30s or in their early 30s. We don't hear about people who quit. They're not sexy stories. I mean, I know it's a horrible thing to be an addict and to have family members addicts, etc. But still, in the kind of attention economy landscape, there's still sexy stories in the sense that they're dramatic, they sell newspapers, they have great headlines, etc. It's not a great headline, it's not a popular story to say this person was addicted to something for 5 years and then quit and now is living a happy, normal life, right? You don't get that reported. So in other words, we overstate or imagine the cases being far more prevalent than they are because we hear about the disasters only. We don't hear about the success stories. So our understanding of addiction is primed by that kind of confirmation bias. And seeing a predictable response in the brain, and people say things like hijacks the reward centers of the brain, or we see kind of a dopamine surge in the brain, etc. Learning a language changes the brain. If you like riding a bicycle, you're going to get a dopamine surge when you ride your bicycle. Doesn't mean it's addictive, doesn't mean it's dangerous. So it's meaningless language to say something changes the brain, or to say there's a dopamine surge, because that always happens when you enjoy something. It doesn't tell us that the thing is a thing you shouldn't be enjoying. That's a different argument. So these sorts of inflated and completely misleading claims dominate the discourse around addiction, and they're all wrong. So this view, which Sally Satel is a neuroscientist who works in a methadone clinic in the US, uses this term neurocentrism, so it's focusing just on the brain. That implies that the solution is always a medical model rather than a behavior intervention sort of model. And if you read a wonderful new book, Johan Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, it's all about addiction. And in there he tells the story about, I forgot the scientist's name, but this guy who developed this thing called the rat park. Okay, so he got rats addicted to heroin. He got rats addicted to heroin. And they tried methadone, they tried drugs in them, etc., and saw what the remission rate was, etc. But then he built this rat park, which was just a large pen in which there were lots of wheels to run around, whatever rats like to do. I can't remember the details. All sorts of fun and games for rats, right? And then he gave them 2 drips, one drip with plain water, one drip with the drug. They invariably, or over time, all went with plain water. They didn't need the drug anymore because they were happy. Okay? So you can do things on a short time scale with rats, sure, but that same model for humans is what we should be attempting. And we've seen great success in places like Denmark, where social welfare does allow for junkies to get money and treatment and housing and whatever it might be. Improve somebody's circumstance, take away the reason why they needed to do the drugs in the first place, and by and large they stop taking the drugs. Okay, so that's where you need to treat addiction, not only in the medical kind of sphere. And lastly, it's a remitting condition as well, so people don't talk about. People drift in and out of addiction. There are people who are addicts rather drift in and out their entire lives. Another lovely example of this is Operation Golden Flow, Nixon, Vietnam War. All of these military veterans were addicted to LSD. The soldiers were, or a bunch of them were. They were told that they couldn't board planes back home unless they quit. So that was Operation Golden Flow. So unless you tested clean, you couldn't get on a plane back home. With that incentive, the rate dropped from, I can't remember the figures, from 14% of soldiers who showed traces in their urine to I think 6%. Just with that incentive. So you can't come home unless you stop. So sorry, it was opium. So opium and heroin, 2 of the most addictive drugs that we're aware of, at least in terms of the standard narrative, and they stopped because they wanted to go back home. 3 years later, they retested these people, and only 7% of them had, again, re-taken up the drug. They stayed off it once they got back home. So, in talking about these social and cultural ways of dealing with addiction, self-binding strategies can make a large difference. What I mean by self-binding strategies is that addicts figure out ways to cope. Now, compare this to diet. They figure out ways to cope in the sense of not walking past the street corner where your dealer is, for example. You walk a different way. Not carrying spare cash, only carrying a card. And so all of those sorts of things are self-binding strategies. You know you've got a problem, so you do certain things. We do the same things with diet, right? So you avoid the donut shop or something obvious like that. Okay, so these interventions can work very well. And the brain level, the neurocentric level, is not yet the level at which our interventions are the most useful. Okay, the behavior modification stuff still makes a huge difference. But the problem is that this addiction story and telling people that they have impulse control issues are, as I said earlier on, a really sexy story. And the human drama of these stories and the context and the detail is very attractive. But when we write about science and talk about science, especially those of us who do it irresponsibly, tend to cherry pick their data. You can find studies to support almost anything. If you go looking hard enough, you can find a study to support your point of view. But that's not what you do if you're a responsible scientist. You look at what the totality of evidence suggests and go with that. So if you just read the things that agree with your point of view and ignore all the others, you're going to be able to justify any point of view you like. If you want to believe in Bigfoot or some sort of alien invasion or whatever it might be, go to wacko conspiracy theory websites and just stay there and you'll see lots of evidence for your point of view, right? Okay, so it's easy to play that game. As Ben Goldacre points out, I think in Bad Pharma, the second book rather than the first one, Bad Science, half of all published studies are wrong or at least critically flawed. And we only discover that down the line, thanks to peer review, which, as I'm sure you know, is one of the good things about science, so we should also be concerned when scientists don't publish their things in peer review journals, but rather to publish cookbooks. How many of the studies were on humans? So again, the rat stuff, the sugar stuff, the Avena paper and the Johnson and Kenny paper were on rats. How many were on humans? How many had control groups? And there might be studies that contradict the studies if you look for them. If you didn't, then again, you're cherry picking. The problem is this has become a battleground, a moral battleground, and it's mostly among the middle classes. You don't hear about things like banting amongst poor people, right? Or amongst people who are struggling to just eat. That's what they care about, is nutrition, is not being hungry anymore. It's only when you start being this kind of middle-class person with too much time on your hands that you suddenly start obsessing about these things. So the middle-class moral panics, you probably can't see, but at Spa, so banting-friendly water. What the hell? I mean, so this is really absurd to start branding your waters as banting-friendly, because again, you're infantilizing your consumers. You're telling them that this was ever an issue, that there was ever a reasonable question to ask as to whether your water was banting-friendly. It was never a reasonable question, so why are you pretending that it is? So, and also this rhetoric, the real meal revolution and all that sort of stuff, it also, I'm sure you've all read the book, but it also verges onto the conspiratorial tones of some of this stuff, the GM stuff and the soy stuff and whatever. I mean, you all know about Norman Borlaug, who's saved billions of people in inventing golden rice. That's a GM product, right? I mean, so what do we prefer? Do we prefer no GM foods and all of those people who survived thanks to golden rice to be dead? No, we don't. So lesser of two evils, I think in this case, suggests that there's room for golden rice and so forth, and for all of these innovations, and that we shouldn't demonize something just out of this kind of fear of something that's unnatural. So left unchecked, if you and I don't stand against this sort of mania and hysteria, food becomes a religion. And that's another lovely example from the US. Our bread slice is used for both organic and conventional. And do you really think that your bread slice is going to kind of taint your bread with some sort of chemical residue from the non-organic bread? No, it's not going to. And yeah, I mean, I won't talk about organic and GM stuff in detail now, but that's just an example of how you can turn this stuff into religious rhetoric. So, we cause harm. We cause harm even though our intentions are good. As I've tried to make clear all the while, the last few years that I've been talking about this stuff, I'm not interested in questioning people's motives. I think they're all intending to do good. I think they're all really believe what they're saying, the people who do this diet evangelism stuff. Well, not all, but most of them. Our local ones for sure. But you can still cause harm, even though you have these good intentions. Because non-communicable diseases and obesity, sure, they're not great things, but we can address them without causing additional problems along the way, without causing infantilization of your audience, without fear-mongering, without making this into a hysterical battleground. So at some point, I worry that we become so well trained in all of this kind of moral panic that we embrace paternalism, that we say, yes, please tell me what to do. I can no longer think for myself. And that's a really, really bad outcome. So when science is infused with enough of this kind of scaremongering, with enough of this kind of paternalism, enough of this scaremongering, the state has a perfect opportunity to step in and look after you, right? They've got the groundwork for paternalism laid down for it. Because this groundswell of middle-class support for the addiction narrative or whatever it might be has encouraged them to say, well, if I'm now going to attack sugar, nobody's going to complain because everyone believes that sugar is poison. Right? Okay, so it prepares the ground for that. Now, I don't have any problem with nudging people to make good choices. And with some are trying to incentivize better choices over worse ones. But a lot of these interventions, if you look at the data, just don't work. So in Denmark, for example, the fat tax cost lots of jobs, cost the fiscus some money, and didn't work in terms of consumption rates. Bloomberg soda tax in New York, so people instead of buying the one large soda which he outbought, bought two sodas. And if you go looking on Google, you'll see these lovely pictures from now 5 years ago of people with two large sodas instead of one enormous soda. And so you find, it creates these perverse incentives, and you find loopholes, you find workarounds for the taxes. And they typically don't work in terms of driving behavior change. The other concern, or the last concern around producers, or second last I think, is that when we demonize food producers and manufacturers, we forget two things. One is that it's not necessarily their job to be the custodians of our moral virtue, right? Again, back to the idea that we should be responsible for our choices. It's our job to be responsible for our virtue. They are in the business of making money. They don't need to lie to us, and they shouldn't lie to us in the course of doing so. But as long as they're not doing that, you can hardly blame them for not deciding to cure world obesity. That's not their job. Okay? Yet somehow that's become the discourse now, that like they're so evil. They make the food that we ask them to. The solution is quite simple. Stop buying stuff and they'll stop making it. Okay? That's really as simple as that. But these panics and the talk of fat taxes and sugar tax, etc., are a systemic way of absolving us of any responsibility and blaming them for, in actual effect, doing a good job. Because they're making these attractive and tasty things and selling them at a price point that makes them further attractive, and we're buying them. So, by all accounts, in terms of market realities, they're doing a good job, and we're blaming them. And to conclude this, to wrap things up, I mean, I've been talking about science and communication of science and critical reasoning and how we should try to encourage it. A background issue to remember is that scientific breakthroughs don't happen in the Daily Mail or on the Dr. Oz show or whatever it might be. They happen in journals which people don't read, as we've been discussing. And that's where they happen. So if you see people in the media hunting things from newspaper articles and from blogs and whatever it might be, we should remind people that that's not where scientific breakthroughs occur. So if you're getting your data from there, then you really should be highly skeptical, if not completely dismissive. You'll hear about some revolution, firstly, as I say, in the journals, and eventually it'll be national news. It won't be some sort of undercurrent amongst, as I said earlier, on middle class board people. The value of science and the scientific method, and the stuff that you and I need to encourage, is to remind people that the value of science is not about its conclusions, it's about its method. It's about how we reach conclusions. And we should be willing to reach uncomfortable conclusions, ones we don't like, so long as we know we did a good job in getting to them. And that's where our virtue lies, that's where our responsibility lies, is in paying attention to method. Being right, we love to be right, but being right is the end product of that method and that process. As Oscar Wilde put it, the truth is rarely pure and never simple. Thank you.